Will Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net, and I'm going to be continuing my beginner opening series. This is part 1 of the French defense, which is what I'm going to recommend for beginners to go ahead and start with against e4. So I've already covered the stonewall attack as an opening for white for beginners, and I will also be releasing in the near future a series about the Slav defense for white, or for what to do for black against d4. So we'll go ahead and move forward with the French here. So this is the characteristic structure. You know, there's just these two moves for each side here. This is the French defense. This is what it's all about. So the main replies are going to be knight to c3, knight to d2, as well as an immediate e5. So that's kind of the main stuff. It's also possible to take the pawn on d5. So right now I'm going to focus on the most critical line with knight c3. This seems to be the most aggressive move. White is, protecting the pawn, putting a little pressure on d5 as well. So here black has effectively two responses, two main lines, you could say, against this knight c3. So one is the bishop b4 line, which I'm going to recommend my beginner viewers and whatnot to stay away from bishop b4 and to stick to I guess you could say, a particular ideology of how to play this French defense as black. So with knight f6, and the reason is because it's going to overlap with some lines against the Tarrasch defense with knight to d2. So anyway, knight f6, and the main response for white is going to be very simple. It's going to be e5, and now black is going back. This might seem a little strange. Why give white this space? And the most aggressive reply here for white is play f4, and so this is the Steinitz attack. And now black is going to play c5. White will go with knight f3, and let's say knight c6. And so in this position, this is such a good example, an illustration of all the tension that's possible in the French defense. And why I'm recommending it in my beginner series is because I think it's one of the easiest openings to learn, and it also fits in very well with the stonewall attack and the Slav defense. As I mentioned, I was going to create those as well. So I wanted to tie in a comprehensive opening system for anything, for any beginner player. So with the French defense, this is what it's all about. There's just, white's got this big pawn center, a lot of pawns on the dark squares here, very strong pawn wedge. And black is playing to, it's kind of like a debate. White is saying, I've got the space, I got this strong center. And black is saying, wait a minute, is that really a strong center or is it a weakness? So black's whole game is really going to just revolve around putting pressure and trying to target those big pawns in the center. So this is a good illustration of all the pressure in the position, going on d4 and also kind of putting some pressure on e5, maybe a future f6. If this is clear, this kind of stuff, just trying to attack those white pawns there. So that's what the position, this is what the French is all about. So knight c6, and now let's say bishop to e3. So I believe this is the aggressive Boleslavsky variation. It seems to be the most typical response, most principled, I guess you could say. And so here, black again has got to make a choice. The immediate f6, I think, is premature. And I'd be pretty careful playing f6 so early in the French until you really know what you're doing. So you want to save that central break until your king is, safely out of there. So the other option, which is very popular, is queen to b6. And this is a very principled move in the French, but against this specific line with bishop to e3, I'm going to recommend you stay away from it because there's some tricky stuff that white's got, ready to pull out here. So black with queen to b6 is kind of a superficial attack on the d4 pawn to me and the b2 pawn because it's very dangerous to have the queen exposed out there. Let's say for a3, if you try to snatch a pawn, you're going to lose your queen. Knight to a4, nice little trap in this line. And the queen on b2 is completely trapped. It has nowhere to go, and black can just resign before 10 moves. So queen to b6, it's a beginner opening sphere. Let's keep it simple, right? So a6 here, and this is a very this plan has been employed by many a strong player. When I was researching these videos, I saw Victor Korchnoi like this a6 early idea, and I've also seen in more recent times Hikaru Nakamura playing it. And a6 very simple. White, the most versatile continuation is probably queen d2, and black is going for the immediate b5. So while these moves might seem kind of strange, we always tell beginners that you got to develop all your pieces in the opening and you know, worry about the pawn moves after your king is safe and everything. But it's critical in this position to continue playing really actively and creating pressure. You know, threats of b4, threats of taking the pawn on d4, for example. There's a lot of tension in the position. And so if pawn takes, really at any time, if you haven't moved the bishop, I'd say just keep it simple and exchange with the bishop. You know, develop that bishop with a tempo. And, you know, even if takes, yes, black is going to be left with a bad bishop, but, you know, you got some pressure in the center. Maybe you can try to get a knight on e4. And if white doesn't take the pawn, what we were just looking at, let's say white just plays, I don't know, bishop to e2, for example. Now it's possible to continue with a move like b4 or bishop to b7 and just continue and complete your development naturally. I mean, let's go with a normal line, maybe bishop to e7. And I think, you know, we've kind of gone far enough for this video. I think we could say here that black has got a very comfortable game, maybe f6 coming to undermine these pawns even more. So, going back, that was one of the most aggressive lines. That was the French Steinitz-Boleslavsky variation involving a quick bishop to e3. So that's what we were just looking at there. So now I want to keep going and keep moving forward. And I want to check out another kind of typical, you know, that was the main line and one of the main ideas for black against e5 and f4. So just to be clear, this kind of situation where black has got all this tension and stuff like that. So now, instead, let's say white doesn't play e5. What if white plays bishop to d3? And this is called the Swiss variation. And this could lead to a little bit of diciness, I suppose, if black is caught unawares. Because it's very easy, for example, to make a positional mistake very early here. Let's say black takes and takes the knight. Well, I usually discourage all of my students, regardless of the level, of initiating exchanges. And this is a great opportunity to explain why. Because we just saw that black, eager to trade pieces and maybe gain equality, is giving white, look at this monster bishop, just controlling the board. And let's say if white, you know, white's idea was to kick the bishop from e4, maybe black is just a step ahead of the game. And now with this bishop on f3, may not seem like a big deal, but how are you going to develop your light squared bishop on c8 in the future for black? It's going to be very problematic, very difficult. So I'm recommending just, you know, in this circumstance after bishop d3, take the pawn. You know, there's other options. c5 can be very sharp, and some of these lines white can sack a pawn and stuff like that. Just keep it simple, and you're going to be just fine. So this is like the ideology for the French. Just keep it simple. You know, you got your basic plans that you like to play. They overlap a lot in these lines, and that's all you got to know. So don't take the knight. Just develop naturally. And I like bishop e7 more than more than knight d7 here, because maybe you wanted to play like c5 and knight to c6 before. So I think it's a little more flexible, bishop to e7. Should also point out, queen takes d4 is going to lose on the spot. You're going to drop a queen to bishop b5 check, opening up a discover attack on the black queen. So instead, I would just say, you know, bishop e7 and let's say knight f3 and just castle. You know, maybe something simple like this where, you know, you got to be careful. Again, that pawn is not a freebie. I mean, these are some common tactics. Let's say queen takes. Seems like it's all good, but knight takes, and now it seems like black is just lost because bishop takes, and the same idea. Bishop takes, h7 check, picking up the black queen. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. So, but even still, I mean, just a common, you know, I'm going to give some sample moves here. Let's say bishop f4, white's developing, and maybe just a common idea for black. It's a good idea to develop the knight here and get it all ready. And maybe to just go ahead and play b6. And now, you know, if takes, knight takes is just fine. You need to be careful. You don't want to let this bishop get this aggressive post here. But, you know, either way, I mean, this is a very basic, you know, standard plan in this Swiss variation here to try to play and achieve counterplay in the center. maybe c5 at a later date. So this is just a good way to play against a lot of these systems. It overlaps where you exchange and just play calm, natural developing moves. Let's go ahead and get the king out and try to play. There's also, instead of b6, c5, the immediate c5 where you're going to liberate and maybe you can get your queen out. There's a couple different plans there. So those are some good ideas of the basics. And for the last part of this video, I want to wrap things up with the knight c3 here, usually the winnower in some lines. So I want to wrap things up with a different line called the burn variation. And I've seen this in a good couple of GM games. It's similar to the Swiss variation we just looked at with bishop to d3, but the burn variation is going to go with bishop to g5 here, a little bit more aggressive. And here's the same principle, what I'm talking about, this French ideology. Just keep it simple. A lot of the lines are going to transpose or have very similar concepts, and just take the pawn. Nothing crazy here. Just take the pawn. Bishop e7, this is just fine. I mean, it's very similar to what we were just looking at. Something like, I'm trying to drop a piece here, right? So maybe takes, stuff like this. This is very, very basic stuff. Just bishop to e7. Just keep it high and tight here, and you're going to be just fine. I mean, whatever white is trying to do, knight to g3, for example, I think this is the most common, is exchanging knight to f3 here. And black, you need to be a little bit careful as black, because you got the two bishops, but white has activity with those knights. But honestly, I think that you just want to try to break white's center and use your two bishops. Let's say knight here, castles, and b6 with the idea of playing c5, bishop b7. Black is going to be just fine. It's very similar to what we were just looking at. Some slight differences, but when you end up exchanging that pawn on e4 and these lines like this, just keep it simple. Just develop logically, and you're going to try to lash at white's center with moves like c5 later, or a lot of times maybe you want to develop the white square bishop with b6 and a fianchetto later as well. So that does it for part one of my new series, the beginner opening series on the French defense. And keep an eye out for parts 2 and 3 coming up soon. So this is Will Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net, and thanks for tuning in.